In the previous video, we talked about states in React. We also implemented states using class components. In this video, we have hooks in React.js. So what are hooks? Hooks in React are special functions that allow you to use state and other React features in functional components without writing a class. And these were introduced in React 16.8 to make it easier to manage the component logic. Let's now try to understand the reason for introduction of hooks. The first reason is, before the introduction of hooks, the React developers often faced challenges with the complex component logic and state management. Secondly, in case of complex scenarios, the class components would become bulky. And that would be the reason that it was not possible or it was difficult to maintain the components because of complex state updates and side effects. And that's the reason the hooks are addressing these challenges by providing a more intuitive and efficient way to manage the component logic. All right, so now there are certain kinds of hooks that help us in either maintaining state or maybe handling side effects, accessing the context values, references, manipulation of DOM elements, and so on. So the very first kind of hook we are going to look at is useState. The useState hook in React allows you to add and manage state in functional components. It returns two values, the current state and a function to update it, and the syntax is as follows. We use an array count which represents the current state, while the second item, set count, is the function to update it. So here we are actually using the concept of destructuring, wherein the useState is the function, it's the hook that accepts the initial parameter. It accepts one parameter wherein we have to specify the initial state. So for now, in this example, the initial state is 0. You can also specify a string or an object. We will now be implementing the counter example using useState hook. So we are going to create one component with the name useState. This is just the name of the component. The name of the component does not signify the actual hook. So we are going to use RAFCE to get the function component, and we will now be importing the useState hook. So why we are using the curly braces here? Because useState hook is actually a constant export. So we know that whenever any class that is constant export, we need to use curly braces inside the file where you want to import it. All right, now within this function, you will be required to create the array, const array. The first item will be the initial state count, and second item is the set count. That is the function which is actually going to update the count. So equals to useState hook, specify the initial value. You can specify the initial value either here, or you can create a separate variable and specify that variable here. As already discussed, we can also mention an object or a string. We can specify an array as well. Right. Now, inside the return statement, we will be now required to fetch the initial value of the count using h1 tag, let's say count. And in order to access the initial value, we have to use count. Next is we will be creating two buttons for both incrementing and decrementing. Increment and second button for decrement. We have to now click on these buttons using onClick event. Click on the second button as well. Now you can either specify your set count function directly here, that is going to update the counter. But for now, since we just started, we are going to create separate functions. So right after this, let's create separate functions as increment count equals to, we'll be creating an arrow function. I'll be using the set count function. So this second parameter, the second item inside this array, set count, is the one that is supposed to change the value. Now changing of value can be either incrementing or decrementing. So here in this case, your function, whatever the function you specify here, it accepts one callback. So within this callback function, there will be one previous state, a previous value. The parameter is supposed to be a previous value. You can give it any name, let's say previous count. Now this previous count is required to be incremented. So we'll be using previous count plus 1. Now since we already know that how the arrow functions work and we can use shortcuts, so whenever we have just one parameter inside the callback, we can remove the parentheses. This is not required, and since only one expression is there, there is no need of these curly braces. Alright, now let's create another one, that is const decrement count equals to parenthesis. We are using an arrow function. So you would be using the curly braces here as well, but as the concept of arrow functions should already be known before doing these examples, so I'm not using these curly braces. I'll simply use set count and use the previous state, that is the previous count, as the parameter, and previous count minus 1. So that's it, your two functions are ready. Now you can call these two functions here, increment and this one for decrement. Let's render our component. Import useState from component slash useState. useState. Let's have a look at the browser. You see that we got a count as 0, increment, and you can also have a decrement count. Let's try to enhance a bit further. What we can do is, instead of using these functions, creating these functions separately, it's much better to use the set count function directly here inside the curly braces. Now this time you will not be required to create the increment count and decrement count functions separately. So I'm going to comment these two. Let's check on the browser. You see your program still works. Now let's do another example where we will be passing an object as the initial state. And for that object, we will try to access one property and change it. So let's comment this code, and we are once again going to create the function And inside this, I'll be considering an array as usual. Now we know the syntax that we always need to consider an array where the first item will be the initial, will hold the initial state, while the second item will be the function that will update it. So let's consider a situation where you have been given the details of a smartphone and you want to change one property from that smartphone object. So right now the smartphone is an object and set smartphone will be the function that will change one of the properties, equals to useState and the initial value. Now initial value is an object. Let's specify the model. Let's say it's Google Pixel 7 Pro. This is the model. Let's have a look at the operating system that it uses. Android 13 OS. Next property, weight. All right, so after the weight, we have the main camera. Next is the storage. And finally, the RAM. We are now ready with the initial state, that is the smartphone which is holding this initial object. Let's render a statement as an h1 tag. The specifications are. Now in order to fetch the property, we need to use smartphone dot the property name. You can easily specify here smartphone, that's the name of the object, dot model, smartphone dot OS. Next is smartphone dot the weight, smartphone dot main camera, smartphone dot storage, and finally we have smartphone dot RAM. Now imagine that we are required to change the RAM of this smartphone. So we'll be using one button. Use on-click event. And within the click of this event, within the click of this button, we need to call a function. And that function will be creating it here. Let's create a function, const update RAM, use the arrow function. So as already discussed that we will be now using this second item, the set smartphone, which will change the RAM. So I'll write here set smartphone, and this accepts a callback. So we will now return the object where we are going to specify the RAM, and we will now change the RAM to, let's say, 16 GB RAM. Alright, let's use this function here on the click of the button. and we will name this button as change RAM. Let's take a look on the browser. The specifications are, you are now able to see the statement. When I click on this change RAM, you see that the RAM has been changed, but the previous properties, the previous state that we specified could not be fetched. So we are required to fetch that as well. For this, inside the callback, you need to pass the previous state. So you can have previous state or prev state, whatever the name you would want to take, you can have it. Previous state, and we need to concatenate it with this RAM, that is the updated RAM. So we will be using here the concept of spread operator. Previous state will be fetched this way along with the updated property, that is the RAM as 16 GB RAM. Let's take a look once again. Click on change RAM and you see that the RAM has now been changed to 16 GB, but the rest of the properties remain as such. You can see it was pretty simple to implement states with the help of useState. Now, what are the advantages of useState hook over the traditional class states? So first of all, it offers a simpler syntax. The useState is easier to write and understand compared to the class state. You don't have to use this keyword because it eliminates the confusion when you need to bind this with the class components. Also, you can manage multiple pieces of states separately. In class components, you can always use state as an object, while that's not the case in useState hook. It can be either an object or an array or a simple value. So that's all for this video. In the next video, we will learn about the next kind of hook, that is useEffect hook.